Welcome back, everybody. Today's deep dive is about a case that's, well, it makes you think about how complex truth and justice can be.
Mm,
We're looking at the death of Barbara Kendhammer and the conviction of her husband, Todd.
right.
We've got this online article. It's called The Todd Kendhammer Case, A Tragic Death, a Controversial Conviction, and the Search for Justice.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
It really is, and it dives deep into all the twists and turns. Like,
Mm.
on the surface, it seems like a freak accident.
Sure.
A husband saying his wife was killed by a random pipe flying off a truck. But when you look at the
Yeah,
details,
they just don't add up.
they really don't. So what are your initial thoughts when you first hear about a case like this? What jumps out at you?
Well, it's that contrast, isn't it? You have this image of a total freak accident, something nobody could control, but then you hear about the lack of evidence for this truck.
Right.
No witnesses, no debris, no security footage. It makes you wonder if this was maybe more staged than accidental?
Exactly. It's like one of those optical illusions. Your brain wants to see one thing, but the reality is totally different.
Yeah.
And speaking of things not being what they seem, let's talk about Todd Kendhammer's story. He claims this pipe came through the windshield and killed Barbara instantly, but he also had bloody knuckles and scratches on his neck.
Hmm.
Pretty strange combination, right?
Absolutely. Those injuries right away make you think there was a struggle, a physical altercation. That doesn't fit with his story of this accident.
No, it really doesn't.
In cases where there's a possible assault, you often see defensive wounds on the victim and injuries on the assailant that suggest they were close. These details, they seem small, but they can be huge red flags.
So it's not just the injuries themselves, but what they tell us about what really happened in that car.
Right.
And speaking of revealing details, the autopsy findings really throw a wrench into Todd's story. The article details multiple injuries on Barbara: a broken nose, those neck scratches we talked about, and the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head and neck. Doesn't that point more to a physical attack, maybe even strangulation, than a random pipe?
The autopsy findings in this case are really interesting. They show the limitations of interpreting physical evidence.
Oh, okay.
Because even though the injuries fit better with an assault than some random pipe, it's so important to not jump to conclusions. A good forensic pathologist will look at every possible scenario. They'll examine the shape of the injuries, how severe they are, the trajectory of any impacts, even if Barbara had any pre-existing conditions.
It's a good reminder that even in forensic science, things aren't always so black and white. There's nuance, interpretation involved.
Lots of it.
But in this case, even with all that nuance, it seems like the physical evidence is casting some serious doubt on Todd's version of events.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
So if we consider that maybe this wasn't an accident, the big question is why? Why would Todd kill Barbara? The article says they were married for 25 years, their kids said they were a loving couple, and there's no mention of financial problems, infidelity, or abuse. It's like the motive is the missing piece.
The lack of a clear motive is one of the most interesting parts of this case.
It really is.
In a lot of investigations, the why is what drives everything. It helps investigators understand the order of events and what the suspect was thinking, but sometimes motives are hidden, even from the people closest to the person.
Yeah.
They can be buried under all these complicated emotions.
It's almost more unsettling that way, isn't it? This idea that someone could do something so violent without a motive we can understand. Does that kind of ambiguity make it harder to build a case?
So it definitely presents some challenges.
Mhm.
Jurors want motives. They look for a reason that explains the crime.
Right.
When there isn't one, there can be hesitation, a reluctance to convict if they don't get that why.
I can see that.
It means the prosecution has to make a really compelling case based on the circumstantial evidence. They have to connect all the dots and leave no room for doubt.
So they need to create a narrative that's so strong and convincing, the lack of motive becomes less important.
Yeah,
And that takes us to the trial, where you have these two competing stories.
right.
Todd saying it was this freak accident versus all this evidence suggesting something much darker. How important are the legal arguments in a case that depends so much on circumstantial evidence?
Oh, they become absolutely essential. The prosecution has to build a narrative, a compelling one, using the physical evidence, expert testimony, witness statements. They need to paint a picture of guilt.
I see.
The defense, on the other hand, has to dismantle that whole narrative. highlight inconsistencies,
Yeah.
question how the evidence is interpreted, and present other explanations.
So it's a battle of interpretations.
You could say that.
And in this case, the defense had a pretty high-profile lawyer, Jerry Budding.
Mm.
He worked on the Stephen Avery case. He definitely knows how to handle these complex legal situations.
He does.
Did the defense just focus on the lack of motive, or were there other angles they used?
I think they probably used a multifaceted approach. Challenging how the physical evidence was interpreted would have been crucial. Maybe they brought in their own experts to explain Barbara's injuries differently. They might have pointed out inconsistencies in what witnesses said, making the prosecution's story seem less reliable.
So it's not just about poking holes in the prosecution's case.
Yeah.
It's about offering another possibility, a different way of seeing the same facts.
Right. And in a case like this, where there's no, smoking gun,
Yeah.
the defense might try to show the defendant as a human being, as a grieving husband, instead of a cold-blooded killer.
Okay.
They want to create reasonable doubt by saying that, yeah, maybe the prosecution's version of things could be true, but it's not the only way to explain what happened.
It becomes a battle for how the jury sees things, doesn't it? Trying to get them on your side. But ultimately, the jury found Todd Kendhammer guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. The article mentions a lot of debate about the verdict. A lot of people think it was a miscarriage of justice. What kinds of things might lead to those doubts even after a guilty verdict?
Well, in cases that rely on circumstantial evidence, there's always some uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike when you have direct evidence, like an eyewitness or a confession, circumstantial evidence has to be interpreted, and different people can interpret it differently. Different jurors might give different weight to different pieces of evidence, and that leads to different conclusions.
So even with a unanimous verdict, there could be people on that jury who weren't totally convinced but felt the evidence was strong enough to meet that legal standard of beyond a reasonable doubt.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder what goes on in those deliberations.
It does, doesn't it?
What they argue about and how they come to an agreement.
How they get there. The dynamics of jury deliberations are fascinating. You've got people from all different backgrounds with different experiences and viewpoints, and they're all looking at the same evidence. There's persuasion, debate, sometimes even compromise as they try to work through a complicated case.
It reminds you that the justice system, even though it tries to be fair, is still run by people.
Right.
And people have biases and limitations.
For sure.
And in this case, those inconsistencies seem to be at the heart of all the controversy around Todd Kendhammer's conviction.
Yeah.
The article says that Todd's defense team is working to get the case reopened. They're arguing that a fair trial would clear his name. What are the usual reasons for appealing a conviction, especially when it's based on circumstantial evidence?
Appeals in cases where someone might have been wrongly convicted usually focus on a few key things. New evidence is a big one.
Okay.
That could be a new witness, or maybe advancements in forensic technology give a new understanding of the existing evidence. Another common reason is something called ineffective assistance of counsel.
What does that mean?
That means the defendant's lawyer didn't represent them well enough during the trial.
So it's not just about proving innocence. It's about showing that there were problems with the trial itself.
Exactly. The appeals process is there as a safety net to make sure convictions are based on a fair and complete examination of the facts. It gives a chance to take a second look and fix any errors that might have happened in the first trial.
It's a long shot, but there's always that possibility that something will come up that could change everything. We've seen it before in other big cases, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Cases that seemed totally closed, suddenly they're wide open again because of new evidence, or because someone looks at the old evidence in a new way.
Advances in forensic science, especially DNA analysis, have helped overturn a lot of wrongful convictions. And sometimes it's not even new evidence, it's just looking at the original evidence with fresh eyes and seeing something that was missed before.
It's a reminder that the search for truth never really ends, does it? It's not always straightforward, and sometimes it takes years, decades even, for the full story to come out. But let's switch gears for a minute and talk about something we haven't really touched on. The impact on the families. Barbara Kendhammer's death, no matter how it happened, is a tragedy for her family and friends. And Todd's children are facing something unimaginable, losing their mother and the possibility of their father being in prison for life.
The effects of a case like this are huge. Families are torn apart, lives are shattered. The emotional toll is enormous. And the children in this case are in an especially heartbreaking situation. They're dealing with grief, confusion, and this public trial that's divided their community.
It's a powerful reminder that behind all the headlines and legal arguments and forensics, There are real people whose lives are forever changed by this. This deep dive into the Todd Kendhammer case has been really thought-provoking. We've talked about the ambiguities of circumstantial evidence, the complexities of the legal process, and the lasting impact on the people involved. If you had to summarize the key takeaways from this case for someone who's just hearing about it, what would you highlight?
I'd emphasize the importance of critical thinking when you're looking at information, especially in cases that depend on circumstantial evidence. Tell them to question everything, consider different explanations, and recognize that there might not be a clear answer.
It's about accepting that things aren't always black and white, knowing that we don't know everything, and understanding that even with a trial and a verdict, there can still be doubts.
It's also important to remember that the justice system, even though it tries to be impartial, is still made up of people. Biases, sometimes we're aware of them, sometimes we're not. They can affect every part of the process, from the investigation all the way to the verdict.
It really makes you think, knowing that even with everyone trying to do the right thing, human error can still influence the outcome. And that brings us back to the core of the Todd Kendhammer case, right? We have this tragic death, a husband who says he's innocent, and all this circumstantial evidence that can be interpreted in different ways. What advice would you give to someone trying to make sense of this case, to understand all the nuances? What's important to remember when they're looking at the information?
I'd say approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism. Don't just accept what either side is saying without thinking critically.
Question everything.
Exactly. Look for inconsistencies, things that don't make sense, and try to come up with other possible explanations for the evidence. And remember, context is everything. How the evidence is presented, the stories that are built around it, that can really affect how we see things.
So it's like being a detective yourself, trying to put the pieces together, but knowing that some pieces might be missing and some might not fit perfectly.
Right. And as you're putting those pieces together, think about the people involved, their motivations, what are their biases, what are their agendas, are they trying to shape the information to get a certain result? The legal system is set up so that each side is fighting for their own outcome.
So it's not just about the facts themselves, but understanding the context they're presented in. And that context includes the human element, the emotions, the relationships, the possibility that someone might be telling the truth or they might be lying. This deep dive into the Todd Kendhammer case has really shown us how complicated truth and justice can be. It's a case that makes us ask tough questions, admit that we don't know everything, and accept that even after a verdict, there might still be doubts. This case really makes you think about how much we can ever truly know about another person's actions, doesn't it?